Afternoon to everybody here and everybody virtual. I know that people are still filtering in. My name is Jelaine Arias. I'm the associate professor here at the School of Public Health, and for purposes of today, my most important role is that I'm the chair of the Grand Rounds Committee. This has been an initiative at the School of Public Health for the last 2 years, and one that I've personally loved to see grow and flourish, in part because of the amazing speakers that we've been able to host at our school. And I just want to say thank you to Dr. Shim today for starting her day with our students. If you don't know, all of our Grand Round speakers spend the first hour of their day with about 10 to 15 of our students at the School of Public Health. And I get to peek in the room as the only faculty member for about a second to make sure things are going smoothly. And the energy there is just truly infectious, and reminds me how important it is for our students and learners to get an opportunity to meet with different kinds of scholars who do different kind of work. So it's my honor to welcome you to today's talk. Dr. Harry Hyman will be doing the formal introduction, but just to highlight that the Grand Round series is really meant to bring in emerging and leading scholars in the area of public health. Dr. Shim is our second speaker of the series this year, and we have 3 more already scheduled for the upcoming spring semester. So I just want to take a second and highlight those real quick. In January, we'll be hosting Dr. Hanny Stoklosa, and we will be co-sponsoring that with the National Center of on Child Trafficking, and very much looking forward to her talk. In February, we'll be hosting Professor Micah Berman in collaboration with the School of Law. Michael Berman is from the Ohio State University, and he will be focusing on regulation of tobacco product. And then in March, we'll be very excited to be hosting Dr. Dustin T. Duncan from Columbian Mailman School of Public Health. So look forward to those. You can get more information about all of our talks on our webpage. But today is most importantly about Dr. Shim, so I will hand it over to Harry so he can do the formal introduction.
Good morning. It's my extreme pleasure to introduce Dr. Ruth Shim, our esteemed speaker, and also a colleague and friend. Ruth and I had the opportunity to work together at Morehouse School of Medicine. When you get to a certain age, you realize that colleagues that are able to combine being exceptionally smart and exceptionally nice are rare. Ruth is one of those exceptional exceptions who also brings tremendous passion and commitment to work focused on creating a more just and equitable society. She also brings an extraordinary list of professional titles and accomplishments. Dr. Shim is the Luke and Grace Kim Professor in Cultural Psychiatry and Professor of Clinical Psychiatry at the University of California, Davis, where she also serves as the Associate Dean of Diverse and Inclusive Education at the University of California, Davis School of Medicine, in addition to which she provides clinical psychiatric care at the UC Davis Early Diagnosis and Preventive Treatment Clinic. She received her MPH in Health Policy from Rollins School of Public Health at Emory and completed both her MD, her MD as well as her residency and fellowship training in psychiatry and community psychiatry at Emory School of Medicine. She's a member of the Board of Trustees of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Scientific Advisory Council of Bring Change to Mind. She also serves on the Research and Evaluation Committee of the California Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission. Dr. Shim serves on the editorial boards of, too many journals to list, and is co-editor of 2 books, The Social Determinants of Mental Health and Social Injustice and Mental Health. I could go on, but I won't. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ruth Shim.
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here, and thank you, Harry, for that very nice introduction. You're also one of those nice and intelligent people, so it's really great to be here. And I also just want to say that it's nice to be back in Atlanta, but also it's nice to be received with such hospitality. It's just, I go and give talks at a lot of places, and you all are uniquely hospitable and uniquely nice and enjoyable to be around. So it's been really great to spend some time with you all. I have a lot to talk about in a very, very little amount of time, so I'm going to jump right in. And I also want to talk about what we're going to be trying to focus on today. We're going to talk about structural racism. I'm going to define a lot of terms that you've heard all of these terms before: structural racism, mental health inequity, social determinants of mental health. You've heard all of these terms before, but I'm actually going to define them because I do think there's a lot of controversy around what these terms mean. And if we don't define them and have like a common language, oftentimes that's part of the problem and how we have difficulty in talking about these things. I'm also going to talk about the impact of structural racism on population-level mental health outcomes, and some population-level outcomes that aren't necessarily directly mental health, and what I hope to spend a majority of our time focusing on today are ways that we might consider collectively, how do we dismantle structural racism as it presents in public health. Okay, so the talk is about structural racism. So unfortunately, we can't just launch right in because people sometimes have difficulty when we talk about racism. So it requires that I give some disclaimers. And it says disclosure/disclaimer because the culture of academia is before you give a talk, you give your disclosures. You say if you have any conflicts of interest. I have no conflicts of interest. However, I have many, many things that I have to disclaim before we can start this talk. So let's start with the many disclaimers. This is a difficult and uncomfortable topic. Sometimes when we talk about these difficult topics, complex feelings will emerge. They include things like guilt, anger, resentment, defensiveness. And as I talk about these things, you may actually perceive me of accusing you of being a number of terrible things, including racist and sexist and all these other terrible things. You also may feel, as I'm giving this talk, that I have some sort of specific political agenda that I am trying to advance here with all of you. You also may feel that I lack objectivity. I bring up all of these things to disclaim because these are all things that have been given to me as feedback whenever I talk about these topics. So it's very important that you be aware that you might feel these things as I give this talk. But I will say that we're going to push forward past that. Because we are public health professionals, and these are difficult emotions to process, and we have to be able to acknowledge and process them if we're going to move forward in this area. So it's okay if you feel these things. I also think it is an opportunity to practice self-reflection. And so if you start to feel some of these emotions or questions billowing up inside of you, it's a good moment to stop and say, what's going on with me right now? Like, why am I feeling this way? What's the emotion? What's underlying how I'm feeling about these things? Okay, I'm still disclaiming, by the way. So it is very, very hard to talk about structural racism. And there are a number of reasons for this. I'm going to try and unpack a few of them. The first is that we have been socialized to believe that it is not polite, that in polite society, we don't talk about things like racism, injustice, and oppression. We learn this very early on. I think that kids are often socialized not to bring up race, and that's not a polite thing. Also, public health professionals have not traditionally been taught that there is a very deep connection between oppression and justice and health. And we know that there is a very strong connection here, but this has just not really always been the focus of the content of material that is told. And then another reason it's so difficult to get into this topic has to do with the fact that after the murder of George Floyd, there was this belief that we were in this racial reckoning period in this country, that we had finally broken through and gotten to this place where we all understood that racism was bad and that we needed to address it. But it says the racial reckoning that wasn't, because unfortunately what actually happened is very different. It's a very different story than this belief that maybe we hit this racial reckoning. And so this is data from the New York Times that shows that white people are less supportive of Black Lives Matter than they were at the beginning of 2020. So prior to George Floyd's murder, there were actually more white people supporting Black Lives Matter than there are now. And you see this huge peak at the time of George Floyd's murder in all racial groups that they looked at in this particular study. And you see this huge drop-off in all racial groups, but you actually see this drop-off among white people to lower rates than even before the period that should have been the racial reckoning. And so it's really hard to talk about these topics, but it's also really hard to sustain focus and interest in these topics, especially when there are narratives that are becoming very popular around why these issues are not issues that we should be focusing on or attending to. And that also makes it very difficult and challenging to move forward in this space. So this is my last disclaiming message, and it is a message of hope. When I find that these things are difficult and challenging to talk about, I often turn to the words of James Baldwin. He said, "I'm not interested in anybody's guilt. Guilt is a luxury that we can no longer afford. I know you didn't do it and I didn't do it either, but I am responsible for it because I am a man and a citizen of this country, and you are responsible for it for the very same reason." So it's okay if we have these emotions, but we need to move forward because guilt is a luxury that we cannot afford. Okay, and with that, we can jump into the talk. I've finished my disclaimers. So I want us to level set here, and the first thing is this population health truth that I think we all need to understand. It's something that I find that the most educated and most talented people, even like the smartest geneticists, do not understand. So I just want to bring this up so that we're all on the same page. There is no genetic basis for race. So what we know when we sequenced the human genome 20 years ago, almost to the day, that 99.99% of genes are shared by all humans. So we have this shared genetic code. And that variation exists in only 0.01% of the human genome, which is amazing. But when we then look at that 0.01%, of that 0.01% of variation, the proportion of total diversity in the human genome, the majority of that 0.01% is within populations. And what that means is that you actually see greater genetic diversity within identified racial and ethnic groups than you see across racial and ethnic groups. And so when we talk about genetic and biological differences between racial groups, that actually does not exist. We see that that tiny little bit of genetic variation happens within racial groups more commonly than in any other place. And then people say, well, that's not really true because, we have these illnesses that fall along racial lines. And the first illness that often comes up is the illness of sickle cell disease. Well, sickle cell disease is a disease that affects Black people, right? And cystic fibrosis is a disease that affects white people. So we can see there that these are racial conditions. And so what you're saying, Dr. Shim, makes no sense. And then I talk to them about the fact that we're confusing racial identity with genetic ancestry. So genetic ancestry talks about it involves sharing a genetic line of descent. And so what we know about that is that some population groups are more likely to carry certain alleles because of shared ancestry, but that may or may not be mapped onto certain regions of the world. And so when we think about sickle cell disease, the 3 countries with the highest rates of newborns with sickle cell disease in the world are Nigeria, Congo, and India. So, we think of, in this country, in the United States, we think of sickle cell disease as a Black disease. But actually, it is a disease of shared genetic ancestry. It's a disease of genetic ancestry that, because of the populations that we see in the United States, we believe that these populations are racially identified when they are these are genetic ancestry relationships. What's really disturbing about that is that what it means is that there are probably a lot of children who have sickle cell disease in this country who have genetic ancestry from the regions of India who are not getting properly diagnosed with sickle cell disease because we're not looking for it in certain populations because we believe it to be a certain type of illness that only affects a certain population of people. Okay, so I've dispelled with the myth of genetics and race, and so let us now do a bit of a history lesson. Let's go back. We're going to go back in time, but before we do, I want to just contemplate this particular quote. And it says, African Americans have higher incarceration rates, higher unemployment, lower incomes, lower home and business ownership, less education, less health care, more disease, and lower life expectancy than whites. If you believe blacks are naturally dumb, sick, criminal, you have your answer for these discrepancies. If, however, you resist using stereotypes to make sense of your world, institutional racism provides a very practical and very traceable explanation for the inferior societal position of African Americans. I want us to contemplate this quote because I know no one in this room would ever say, I believe black people to be naturally dumb, sick, and criminal. No one would ever say that. But we look at all of those metrics that lead to the inferior societal position of African Americans, and we don't always turn to the institutional racism explanation for that. Again, we would never say black people are naturally dumb, sick, and criminal, but we also don't consistently look at the causes and how institutional racism actually is why black people are in the inferior societal position in this country that they are. Okay, so how did we get to that place? How did we get to black people being in this inferior societal position? This is the history lesson. So we think maybe you've seen this famous painting before. It's called the Signers of the Declaration of Independence. And it was at this moment in 1775 where we were at the height of our desire as a country to be independent from England. Thomas Jefferson and others crafted this document, and then these men gathered in this room to sign this document. And we know like the history of this incredible document. We know about this quotation that we give so much weight and power to and so much idealism about how we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So tremendous ideals by which this country was founded. But we also have to acknowledge, as we're looking at this picture, that when these men gathered together in this room to declare these tremendous ideals, partly they put it right there in the document. They said that all men are created equal because they specifically weren't talking about women, but they also weren't talking about people of color. They were not talking about indigenous people. They were not talking about black people. They were not talking about any other population other than the land-holding white men that you see in this room. That the land-holding white men were allowed the rights, the unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but nobody else. So they really, the painting, I think, says it all. These were the people that felt that these laws and these rules applied to. And what we see throughout history in our country since that time is we see laws and policies that have been passed reflecting these ideals. Laws that have been passed to advantage certain populations, the populations that look like the people in this painting, and laws and policies that have been passed to disadvantage other populations. And so that's how you see the beginnings of how we could get to certain populations having an inferior societal position, and not be able to kind of understand that that is traced back to the political decisions that we've made over time. Okay, I want to shift gears for a second to define two concepts that come up all the time. So we talk about health disparities, and I want to contrast that with health inequities. So again, definitions are very important. We define health disparities as differences in health status among distinct segments of the population, including differences that occur by gender, race or ethnicity, education or income, disability, or where you happen to live. We contrast that with the definition of mental health inequities, which are defined as disparities in health that are the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. So these are two pretty different definitions. One definition is saying a disparity is a difference between two groups. The other definition is saying an inequity is a difference between two groups that was very intentionally the result of systemic, avoidable, and unjust social policies and practices. So it's not wrong to talk about disparities, but what happens is if you're just talking about a disparity and you're not laying on the point about an inequity, is if you do not define the cause of the problem, people tend to kind of make their own assumptions about what the cause of the problem is. And so when you say, looking at a disparity definition, that it's a difference in health between race and ethnicity, but you haven't said what's driving that difference in health, what we have tended to do traditionally over time is seat the problem in the individual. We've said that maybe that particular population group is biologically or genetically inferior, or maybe that particular population group has cultural problems in the ways in which they think about certain things. Maybe they don't value health culturally in the way that other groups do. Maybe they have more belief systems that make them not want to interface with populations. I know we do that in mental health a lot. We talk about how certain cultures have high rates of stigma and things like that. So it's not wrong, but it runs the risk of us not identifying where the actual problem is, the actual driver of health inequities. And the actual driver of health inequities are systemic, avoidable, and unjust social and economic policies and practices that create barriers to opportunity. If we are not specifically naming it, then we are running into a risk of interventions that aren't actually addressing the drivers of the problem. I'm going to talk a lot more about this, but I want it to be clear that I tend to use the term racial, I tend to use the word health inequities whenever I'm talking about differences in health outcomes that we see for this particular reason. The other important thing that I have to do is define social determinants of mental health. And they are the societal, environmental, and economic conditions that impact and affect mental health outcomes across various populations. These conditions are shaped by the distribution of money, power, and resources at global, national, and local levels, which are themselves influenced by policy choices. And the social determinants of health are prominently responsible for both the health disparities and inequities that are seen within and among populations. So it's basically saying that the decisions that we make about our policies, the choices that we make about policies at global and national and local levels, they are the things that lead to differences in health outcomes and particularly health inequities that we see. Okay, so I want to take this time to do a shameless plug for my books. But really what this is a placeholder for is to help you understand that I've had an evolution of my thought process around thinking about this. And so the first book that I wrote with my colleague, Dr. Michael Compton, we edited this book called The Social Determinants of Mental Health. And at that time, not everybody was people were thinking about the social determinants of health, but there was not really a focus on how that impacted mental health. And so we set about trying to understand, let's gather all the evidence that exists about how social and environmental conditions negatively impact mental health outcomes. And so we gathered all of that data and we kept doing all of that work. But I kept feeling like as we were pulling that data together that we were missing something, that there was something else that was a big driver of the creation of the social determinants of mental health. And as time went on, that's when I came to understand the role that social injustice plays in creating the context for the social determinants of health. And so that's why my colleague, Dr. Sarah Vincent, and I edited the social injustice in mental health to really make that point. And so that point which I think is a critical and important point. I want to make that point for all of you right now. And we do that with this conceptualization that again, Dr. Compton and I created in thinking about the original social determinants of mental health. And so this is a complicated figure. It may be a little bit hard to see, but I'm going to walk us through it slowly. At the top of this figure, you see adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities. And if you move one step below, each time you move below the figure, you are moving further upstream. So one step below the figure, one step below the top adverse mental health outcomes, you see a number of risk factors. And in public health, we love to talk about risk factors, right? And we know and we define a risk factor as something that precedes an illness and increases the likelihood that somebody might develop that illness or outcome. And so all of these risk factors are very important in driving adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities. Things like reduced options and poor choices, behavioral risk factors, physiologic stress responses, and psychological stress. And so another thing that I notice, it's not just public health that likes to talk about risk factors. In medicine, we do a lot, and in mental health work, behavioral health work, we do a lot of risk factor identification. We identify risk factors for suicide. We identify risk factors among a continuum of areas. And my whole kind of conceptualization of risk factors is, and what my clinical experience has told me, is that oftentimes when we're intervening at the level of the risk factor, we're intervening too late. Because there has been context that has been created that has led to the development of that risk factor. And by the time we get to trying to intervene on the risk factor, there has been too much damage that has already been done. And so if we think about how do we intervene prior to the development of the risk factor, that's when we get into this middle section, which are the social determinants of mental health. That's further upstream. And of course, we call these things the social determinants of health, and in this particular figure, the social determinants of mental health. But they've been called by many names by many people long before we started talking about social determinants. Bruce Link and Joe Phelan call these things the fundamental causes of disease. And Sir Michael Marmot, who is really the key person in social determinants of health, and his mentor, Sir Jeffrey Rose, they refer to these things as the causes of the causes. So these are all of the social determinants of mental health that are driving risk factor development that are leading to adverse mental health outcomes. And so they include things like adverse early life experiences and discrimination and exposure to violence and conflict and interactions with the criminal justice system, as well as low education, unemployment and underemployment, poverty and income inequality, and area-level poverty, and homelessness and housing insecurity and food insecurity and transportation insecurity and poor access to health care, and also adverse features of the built environment, neighborhood disorder, pollution exposure, and climate change. This is not an exhaustive list of the social determinants of mental health, but it's a starting place. And so here we are with the social determinants of mental health, the causes of the causes, and these are the things that are driving the development of the risk factor, which are leading to these adverse mental health outcomes. But again, as I have thought about this over and over again, I've come to understand that if you're intervening at the level of the social determinant, you are intervening too late, because there is context that was created prior to the development of the social determinant of health. And what is the thing, the underlying factor, that context that happened even before the development of social determinants? That's actually social injustice or unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity in our society. And so and we could call that the causes of the causes of the causes, really. And what's actually driving this social injustice? What's the thing that's leading to this unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity? Well, we've identified that as two things. The first are social norms, or our ideas and our beliefs about who in our society is worthy of advantage and who in our society is less worthy of advantage or possibly worthy of disadvantage. And then based on those social norms, the public policies, the laws, the procedures, the things that we pass, the rules that we pass in our society based on our reflection of who is worthy of advantage and who is not. And so that intersection of our social norms and our policies and our public policies then lead to the unfair and unjust distribution of opportunity, which then creates the context that develops the social determinants of mental health, which then leads to the risk factors, which then lead to adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities. That was a lot. But now I'd like to walk us through an example of how this figure kind of plays out in the real world. And so I'm going to use the example of the crack cocaine epidemic. And I know some of our students actually weren't alive during the crack cocaine epidemic during the 1980s, which is really bizarre to me, but it's okay. So I will tell you that back in the 1980s, there was this huge rise in the use of crack cocaine in the United States, and it was particularly a particularly damaging drug, particularly for Black people. It was used at epidemic rates. It was actually used by similar rates in different populations, but it was particularly destructive in the Black community. And our social norms that we had, kind of driven by the media and driven by perceptions of who used crack cocaine, were highly racialized and highly gendered. Okay? So when I say highly racialized and highly gendered, when we thought about Black men using crack cocaine at that time, we thought about dangerous, violent criminals. And when we thought about Black women using crack cocaine at that time, we thought about terrible mothers who were more interested in using drugs than caring for their children. And these were the negative and destructive social norms we had about the types of people who use these drugs. And in our mind, and I mean our as a society, in our mind, we did not think that these were people that were worthy of advantage in our society. Our social norms were deeply negative about this population. And based on these social norms, we passed a number of laws that reflect that belief system. And probably one of the most important laws that we passed at that time was the 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act. And that act is the act that created a 100-to-1 jail sentencing disparity between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. And so what that meant is if you were arrested at that time under that law, and you had 1 gram of crack cocaine in your possession, you got the exact same jail sentence as somebody who had 100 grams of powder cocaine in their possession. And this is really shocking to believe, right? Because 1 gram of one drug is obviously a drug that you're using for personal use, whereas 100 grams of a drug is a drug that you're intending to sell and distribute. And to make this law in which there's no distinction in the jail time was really criminalizing the idea that if somebody had a substance use problem, that they were pretty evil, based on our social norms about what they were doing. And so what ended up happening is that this law, which created this huge jail sentencing disparity, activated a number of social determinants of mental health. And if we think about it, just the fact of mass incarceration, which is what happened, which was a result of these laws and this war on drugs that we entered into. But also, if you think about what happens after somebody gets out of jail, so all of these people were incarcerated at very high rates based on these laws for substance use. And then once they were incarcerated, if they happened to get out of jail, the first thing in trying to kind of re-enter into society, you would have to check this box that said you've been convicted of a felony. And when you check that box, it's very, very hard to get a job. And so that activates employment and underemployment and employment insecurity. And unemployment. But then if you don't have a job, then you don't have income, which activates poverty. And it also means that it activates a number of social determinants of health, like housing insecurity, transportation insecurity, and of course in this particular country, and food insecurity, of course. And then in this country, we have tied health insurance for many, many years to your employment. So if you don't have a job, you also usually, at that time, you didn't have health care. So a number of social determinants were activated by these laws and policies that were made based on our social norms. But also, it had sweeping intergenerational effects as well, because we know that one of the adverse childhood experiences is having a parent who is incarcerated. So now you have this adverse childhood experience that's now, this incarceration is now causing an impact on the children of the person that's incarcerated. So you see these multi-generational effects. You see all of these social determinants activated by this unfair and unjust policy. Which then leads to a number of risk factors being activated, which then leads to adverse mental health outcomes and mental health inequities in this population. I want to say two more things before I move on. And the first is that you see in this figure, it doesn't say a 100-to-1 jail sentence disparity, it says 18-to-1. And that's because after much lobbying and much work, in 2010, the law was changed from a 100-to-1 jail sentencing disparity to an 18-to-1 jail sentencing disparity. So we're talking about a drug that's the same drug, right? It's the same chemical compound. There's no difference between these two drugs. And when presented with all of the data about how this was an unfair policy that was adversely impacting certain populations, instead of eliminating this policy, the very best that could be done is an 18-to-1 jail sentencing disparity, and that is the current law of the land. And then the other issue is, remember I said 1 gram of crack cocaine is what you use for your personal use. That implies that you have a substance use disorder instead of 100 grams, which implies that you're selling and distributing a drug. And this is highlighted by Ernest Drucker, who wrote A Plague of Prisons. He said the fundamental clinical accountability to drug treatment professionals to individual patients has been subordinated to the goals of the criminal justice system. Our policies at that time were to incarcerate people who used crack cocaine rather than try to treat people who use crack cocaine for substance use disorders. And I like us to just think about and contrast that with the social norms we have about people who use opioids, because they're very, very different. And we start from a place of having a different fundamental belief system about the type of people who use opioids, who they are, if they're good people or bad people. And we then have passed a very different set of policies related to our beliefs about those particular populations. And that has led to different outcomes. These epidemics, the opioid epidemic is of course incredibly deadly. But we're not seeing the inequities, where we at least originally didn't see those inequities based on the ways that our policy decisions were very different and how we saw these populations were very different from the start. Okay. I don't have a lot of time left. I told you I had a lot of stuff to talk about, but I have several more concepts that I want to get through, so I'm going to try and race through. The first is I want to define structural racism, and it's one of those multi-part definitions that comes from the Aspen Institute. It's a system in which public policies, institutional practices, cultural representations, and other norms work in various, often reinforcing ways to perpetuate racial group inequity. This is a system that identifies dimensions of our history and culture that have allowed privileges associated with whiteness and disadvantages associated with color to endure and adapt over time. It is not something that a few people or institutions choose to practice. Instead, it's been a feature of the social, economic, and political systems in which we all exist, and it does not require the actions or the intentions of others. And what that means is that we could get rid of all of the interpersonal discrimination and racism that exists in our society today. The one-on-one racism, the racism we hear about in the news all the time. We could get rid of all of that, and we would still see racial and ethnic inequities due to the persistence of structural racism, due to the way it's been baked into the fabric of everything that we do, so much so that it's been basically rendered invisible. Okay, a couple of other concepts I want to talk about. The first is essentialism. Essentialism is the belief that there are distinct, unchanging, and natural characteristics that define social groups and facilitate their categorization. We love to put people into boxes. We love to be able to say that people are either this or they are this. And unfortunately, human beings do not categorize as easily as we believe them to be. So around particular things like race and ethnicity and gender and sexuality, we do not fall into these boxes in the ways that we have tried to put people into these boxes for many, many periods of time. The very act of trying to put people into these discrete boxes is the act of essentialism. And so we have to think about how are we essentializing and where are the ways in which we can not do that going forward, especially when thinking about structural racism. Erasure of context is when we fail to consider the socio-historical context when seeking to understand the etiology of inequities. And so there are many, many examples of this, but one of my favorites is the work of Jonathan Metzl, who talks about the protest psychosis and how in the time of the civil rights, there was this rise in seeing Black men in particular who were advocating for their civil rights, seeing those behaviors as psychotic behaviors. And at that same time, seeing those behaviors without the socio-historical context of understanding the purpose of the civil rights movement. Many of those psychiatrists were white men in particular who were looking at the behaviors of these Black men without the context, without the socio-historical context. And you saw this huge rise and shift of the demographics of schizophrenia to become a demographics in which Black people are overdiagnosed with schizophrenia and underdiagnosed with mood disorders like bipolar disorder. And what's interesting is how persistent that has been, how to this day, Black people are overdiagnosed with schizophrenia and underdiagnosed with bipolar disorder based on this long-standing erasure of context. And then biological determinism is the false belief that racial groups are biologically and genetically different. It's funny, again, smart people don't always understand this concept. It is a false belief, but many people believe biological determinism to be true. And the example that I like to give is a 2016 study by Hoffman and colleagues who looked at University of Virginia medical students and found that a significant number of medical students believe things like Black people have thicker skin than white people, Black people have fewer nerve endings than white people. Again, this was a recent study that was done. So biological determinism is alive and well. And also there is cultural determinism, which is like biological determinism's cousin, almost. It is the false belief that the differences that we see in racial groups are primarily the result of cultural factors. We often see this play out in the descriptions of diet. Certain cultures, we hear people talk about, well, certain cultures have higher rates of diabetes, and that's because these cultures tend to eat certain foods that predispose them to diabetes. That is often, it's of this belief that it is a cultural belief system that's driving negative outcomes, but also it's an erasure of context not to understand the policy choices that go into how cultures eat and the foods that they have access to. Okay, I have a few more things, but I promise I'm winding down. I want to talk about the several different types of oppression that exist, and this comes from Iris Marion Young's work on the 5 faces of oppression. And she talks about exploitation, which is the unequal exchange of one group's labor and energies for another group's advantage and advancement. We think of things like human trafficking as examples of exploitation, but there's also examples kind of in our everyday society of like migrant farm workers and warehouse workers. Many people in our society are exploited. Cultural imperialism is when we establish the ruling class culture as the norm, and we other those groups that are not part of the dominant culture. I see this show up a lot in research. So I'm often looking at research studies that break populations up by race and look at odds ratios to determine which racial group has worse outcomes from the other. And almost in every study that I ever see, white people are always the reference group when looking at an odds ratio. And even when they are not the most common group in the study. So if they are not even the most populous group in the study, they're often still seen as the reference group, because we kind of automatically in this country kind of view white people as the reference group. We see them as the reference, and then we other all those groups that are not part of them, that reference. Powerlessness is when oppressed groups lack power and are blocked from routes to gaining power. So we see this commonly show up. Probably the best example is voter suppression, in which certain populations aren't given the opportunities to be able to seek power and representation. Marginalization is when we expel specific groups from meaningful participation in society. We have many, many examples of this throughout history. Mass incarceration, of course, is one example of that, but also a huge, we've done this along racial lines for a long time. So, for example, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Japanese internment, we have done many ways in which we have taken particular groups and attempted to expel them from our society. And then violence are threats and experiences of personal and structural violence. And I want to kind of highlight that for violence, there is an intersectional component that happens around oppression. And that, for example, trans people of color are most likely to be the victims of physical violence at epidemic rates in this particular country. That is an example of how the intersectional identities of trans women of color leads to higher risk of oppression in the form of violence. Okay. I want to give some examples. I want to go over the data really quick and then fly through the solutions. But we've already talked about the war on drugs. I'm going to highlight residential segregation as it relates to COVID-19. Immigration policy interacts with population health in many ways. One, in kind of how we decide who deserves entrance into this country and who does not, and which countries we are open to having more people come from those countries into this country in immigration policy, and which countries we are not interested in having people from those countries come into our country. But the way it affects health in particular that I'm thinking of relates to the fact that we have quotas around mental health, particularly if you have a serious mental illness or if you have a substance use disorder, you will be screened upon immigration, applying to immigrate into this country. If you have those things, you're not going to, you have a very low likelihood of being accepted into this country. So what we're doing is we're screening out people that have serious mental health problems and other health problems. And so we have this incredibly healthy population that's coming in from the immigrant population, far healthier than people who are native born in the United States. Then we look at these populations and we compare them and we say, wow, immigrants are far healthier than our native-born populations. One, we say our native-born populations, obviously they are just terrible about their health, but also maybe immigrants are just really, really good at taking care of their health. And we talk about the healthy immigrant effect, and we spend all this time kind of analyzing what are the choices that they're making. And we never stop to say, well, maybe our population that we're comparing is actually the problem based on these policies. The Social Security Act of 1935, very briefly, we know this was the act that created this is the act that it did create this too, but it created Social Security benefits. And these Social Security benefits are very important because they allowed people to be able to retire when they had, in their old age, people could retire and they would get these benefits. They paid into the system and they would get these retirement benefits. They could pass wealth on to their children and their grandchildren. But when this act was passed, in order for it to get approved through Congress, Southern senators required that they exclude domestic and agricultural workers. In the South at that time, the overwhelming majority of domestic and agricultural workers were Black people. So what that meant is that Black people, although they worked their whole lives as well, couldn't pay into the system and retire with retirement benefits. They could not pass wealth on to their children and grandchildren. So you started to see this huge gap in income take off with the Social Security Act of 1935. And then I'm also going to talk about mental health care in particular. So I mentioned residential segregation. This is data that shows the excess risk of Black residents living more than 1 mile from a potential COVID-19 vaccination site. So at the time that we got the vaccine and we were starting to set up vaccine sites across this country, a policy decision we made is, where are we going to put these COVID vaccination sites? And what you see is that Black residents had significantly farther to go to get to the first vaccine site, based on residential segregation and the ways that we've set up our systems. But what's really important here that I want to highlight is you see in these places like Queens County, New York, and DeKalb County, Georgia, here we are, we see people having to go significantly farther if you're Black to get to the first vaccination site. But what's the narrative that we have around Black people and COVID vaccinations? It's that Black people have vaccine hesitancy. They don't want to get the vaccine. They have cultural beliefs that make it so that they are less likely to get the COVID vaccine. And what we haven't looked at as much are what are the structural things that we have put in place that make it harder for people to get the vaccine. And of course, if we haven't thought about that, then we're designing the wrong interventions, right? Because then you're going to spend all of your time trying to address vaccine hesitancy instead of putting vaccine sites in neighborhoods and locations where people can access those things. And I'm certainly not saying either or here. I'm saying that we have to think about both of these things when we're considering this. The same when we think about mental health conditions. This is data from 2018 from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. It found that 69% of Black adults and 67% of Latinx adults with any mental illness received no treatment, and 42% of Black adults and 44% of Latinx adults with serious mental illness, that's major depression, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia, received no treatment whatsoever. And for substance use disorders, 89% of Latinx adults with substance use disorders and 88% of Black adults with substance use disorders reported receiving no treatment whatsoever for these conditions. So again, our traditional cultural deterministic narratives of this are Black and Latinx people have really high rates of stigma, or maybe Black and Latinx people, maybe they don't value their mental health that much, maybe they don't think that they have a problem even when they do. But actually, when they looked at the data and asked people why didn't they get care, cost was the most commonly cited reason why people didn't seek mental health services. Twice as often as minimizing symptoms and nearly 5 times as often as stigma. So again, how we have designed the mental health care system in this country makes it so that people cannot afford to get mental health treatment, and yet we think of these things as internal problems and decisions that people make rather than the structural issues that are driving us. Okay, so in the time that I do not have left, I'm going to talk about where we need to go and what the solutions look like. So we're currently in this state of inequality where we have unequal access to opportunities. And when we're thinking about solutions, some people think that the solution should be equality. The recent Supreme Court decision on affirmative action is an example of an equality-based solution. It is, okay, we can fix this problem, but whatever we do, we have to be fair. We have to make sure we're not giving one population something that's more than the other population. So equality focuses on fairness above all other things. And you can see that if you are focusing on fairness above all other things, you may not be accomplishing the solution that you set out to do. So one of the things we have to do is shift from an equality perspective to an equity perspective. And equity is when you customize the tools to identify and address the inequity. So this is you give the population the specific thing that that population needs to be successful. And you focus on making sure that population has what it needs. So equity is key, but it's not enough just to have equity. We actually have to combine equity with justice. And justice is when we fix the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunity. So equity combined with justice, and the recommendations that we're going to talk about going forward are thinking about how we combine equity and justice together. So how do we move from aspiration to action? That requires anti-racist leadership. And the work of anti-racist leadership is deep reflection, establishing anti-racist mindsets, modeling anti-racist practices, and embedding anti-racist structures throughout our organization. And so this work happens in individual learning, interpersonal actions, and institutional transformation. So we'll talk about those things. Institutional transformation work, this is a figure from a really great paper that was published in Cell in 2021 that was titled Fund Black Scientists. And it really talks about how because the NIH has such a gap in funding, a funding disparity in who gets NIH funding, we're seeing a stifling of innovation and creativity. And so the article provides some really great options for how we might think about trying to move past the barriers that we've created to prevent, the structural barriers we've created to prevent Black scientists from being successfully funded. If we're going to eliminate social injustice and mental health, we have to think about these 4 things, and I'll talk about all of them very quickly. The first is education and self-reflection. Here are books that are very important to read if you want to be on a personal journey of education and self-reflection in this place. This is just a starting point, but all of these books are incredibly helpful for shifting your thought process, especially again, because we don't traditionally learn these things. And then this is this is the lighter version of the books. Like, those books are kind of heavy hitter books. These books are like, you can dip your toe and get started, and it won't require the same level of mental energy. And also these are podcasts and documentaries that I think are very helpful for thinking about these issues. So if you're not a big reader, this is the page for you. We have to practice cultural humility, which involves committing to a lifelong process of self-evaluation and self-critique, and a desire to fix power imbalances between providers and clients, and to develop community partnerships to advocate within the larger organizations in which we participate. And we have to combine that with work of structural competence. In the clinical arena, this is how we see clinical problems showing up, and understanding that those problems, when we see that one person in front of us, how those problems are influenced by the upstream social determinants of health that influence those individual patients. And then we need to promote social norms of inclusion, equity, and respect. We do that by enforcing social norms of inclusion and equity, and educating or legislating to change social norms. When I say educating or legislating, I mean that some people who violate social norms just don't know any better, and so you can educate them. But then there are groups of people, a small number of people, that no amount of education is going to change how their belief system works. And thankfully, we have laws and policies that prevent those people from doing major damage. We can prevent them from interacting with students, for example. We can keep them from doing kind of large-scale harm around social norms. This work involves observing and challenging your own implicit biases, and of course, evaluating and breaking down unnecessary hierarchies. If we're going to advocate for equitable public policies, we need to take action beyond the walls of our research institutions. We need to advocate for those policies that address social determinants of mental health. Importantly, we need to communicate with elected officials and promote equitable representation, and we need to form cross-sector collaborations and conduct racial equity assessments. So in the world of public health, the APHA has talked about racism as a public health crisis. They've even done an analysis of racial declaration statements. And in Georgia, the DeKalb County Board of Commissioners and the South Fulton City Council are the two entities, the two public health entities that have released racial declaration racial declarations that racism is a public health issue or that racial disparities need to be addressed through public policies. That's a small number compared to some states and some states' public health organizations, but it's a starting place, so I'll take it. We do know that the CDC also announced that racism was a public health crisis, so this is work that is moving in the public health sphere and changing over time. So I want to end with a couple of thoughts, a couple of final thoughts. The first is I started this talk saying that you may think I have a political agenda that I'm trying to advance, and the truth of the matter is I am trying to advance a political agenda because political stances and policy interventions are required. If you remain apolitical or neutral, that is a political stance because you are tacitly accepting the status quo. So in my mind, it is unacceptable to be neutral in this space. And of course, I love to quote Audre Lorde, and I will tell you that we all have a responsibility to speak up and take action around this issue. She said, when we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard nor welcomed, but when we are silent, we are still afraid, so it is better to speak. And I'm gonna end with three more final thoughts, and then I promise I will be done. The first is that we have made progress. I don't want this talk to seem bleak. We have made progress in racial equity and addressing structural racism. It's made through the passage of legislation, through court rulings, and other formal mechanisms that aim to promote racial equality. But always with progress comes retrenchment. And retrenchment refers to the ways in which progress is very often challenged, neutralized, or undermined in key policy arenas. I would say that we're in a period, and we've been in a period for a while now, of deep retrenchment, and that makes it hard to feel like we're making progress, and it also can sometimes cause us to feel sometimes some despair as we attempt to do this work. And so I leave you with the words of my and your Congressperson, John Lewis, who said, "Do not get lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. Our struggle is not the struggle of a day, a week, a month, or a year. It is the struggle of a lifetime. Never, ever be afraid to make some noise and get in good trouble, necessary trouble." Thank you. And sorry for going over. It's okay. Thank you. Okay, thank you.